The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud of uncertainty as General George Washington gazed across the East River toward Manhattan. It was August 27th, 1776, and the fate of the Continental Army and perhaps the entire American Revolution hung in the balance. Behind him, the sounds of retreat echoed through the woods as his battered forces pulled back from what would become one of the war's most devastating defeats. Washington's weathered hands gripped his telescope as he surveyed the British fleet, anchored in New York Harbor. 400 ships stretched across the water like a forest of masts, carrying 32,000 of King George III's finest soldiers and 8,000 Hessian mercenaries. It was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, commanded by General William Howe, a man whose military reputation preceded him across the continents. The American position seemed hopeless. Washington's Continental Army numbered barely 20,000 men, many of them untrained militia who had never faced professional European soldiers in battle. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had answered the call to arms with more courage than experience. Now, trapped on Long Island with their backs to the water, they faced annihilation. 3 days earlier, the British had begun their assault on Brooklyn. Washington had positioned his forces along the heights of Guam, a ridge running across the western end of Long Island. The plan seemed sound: hold the high ground and force the British to attack uphill through dense woods and prepared positions. But Howe had proven more cunning than anticipated. The British general had divided his forces into 3 columns, while to attack the American left and center as expected, Howe personally led the main force on a wide flanking movement through Jamaica Pass. The maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. By dawn, 10,000 British and Hessian troops had swept around the American right flank, catching Washington's forces in a deadly trap. According to military historian David McCullough's detailed account in 1776, the Battle of Long Island represented the Continental Army's first major engagement with British regulars, and the results were catastrophic. Entire regiments dissolved under the disciplined volleys of redcoats and the savage bayonet charges of Hessian grenadiers. The Maryland 400 made their legendary stand at the Old Stone House, buying precious time with their lives as their comrades fled toward the Brooklyn fortifications. As Washington watched his armies retreat through his field glass, he understood the gravity of the situation. The British controlled the seas, and their fleet could easily move up the East River to cut off any escape route to Manhattan. If Howe pressed his advantage, the Continental Army would be destroyed, and with it, any hope of American independence. The general's aide-de-camp, Colonel Joseph Reed, approached with grim news. From the front lines, casualties were mounting, ammunition was running low, and morale had plummeted. Some officers were already discussing the possibility of surrender, but Washington's jaw set with determination as he lowered his telescope. Retreat might seem like defeat, but sometimes the most courageous act was knowing when to preserve one's forces to fight another day. The decision that would define his leadership and ultimately save the revolution was already forming in his mind. Night fell over Brooklyn Heights like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a bone-chilling rain that soaked through uniforms and dampened already flagging spirits. General Washington moved through the American lines, his tall frame unmistakable even in the darkness as he spoke quietly with his officers and soldiers. The gravity of their situation had become clear to every man in the Continental Army. They were trapped. General Howe's forces had spent the day consolidating their victory, bringing up artillery and supplies while systematically tightening the noose around the American positions. British warships patrolled the East River, their guns trained on any potential escape routes. The HMS Asia and HMS Phoenix had taken position to prevent any crossing to Manhattan, while smaller vessels maintained a constant watch along the shoreline. Colonel John Glover of the 14th Massachusetts Regiment found Washington near the fortifications, studying maps by candlelight in a makeshift command post. The Marblehead colonel's weathered face showed the strain of the day's fighting, but his eyes held the steady resolve of a man accustomed to facing storms at sea. His regiment, composed largely of fishermen and sailors from the Massachusetts coast, had performed admirably during the retreat, maintaining discipline when other units had broken. "General, the men are asking questions," Glover reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to know if we're going to surrender." Washington looked up from his maps, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a musket volley. The situation appeared hopeless from every angle. The American army was outnumbered to 2-1, cut off from supplies and facing an enemy that controlled both land and sea approaches. British sentries had been spotted moving closer to the American lines throughout the evening, and it was only a matter of time before Howe ordered a final assault. The Brooklyn fortifications, hastily constructed over the past months, would not withstand a determined attack by professional siege artillery. Washington's senior officers had gathered for a war council, their faces grave in the flickering candlelight. General Nathanael Greene, still recovering from fever, argued for an immediate attempt to break through British lines. General John Sullivan, recently exchanged after his capture earlier in the day, advocated for negotiation. But it was General Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran of the French and Indian War, who voiced what many were thinking, were pinned like foxes in a hole. George, maybe it's time to consider terms. The weight of command had never felt heavier on Washington's shoulders. These men had trusted him with their lives, and he had led them into what appeared to be certain destruction. The Continental Congress expected him to hold New York at all costs, but the cost might be the entire army. Without these soldiers, there would be no revolution, no independence, no United States of America. Outside the command post, the sounds of an army in distress filtered through the rain. Wounded men called for water and medical attention, while others huddled around small fires that offered little warmth. Sentries paced their posts, peering through the darkness for signs of British movement. Everyone knew that dawn would likely bring the final assault, but as Washington studied his maps and considered his options, an audacious plan began to take shape in his mind. The British controlled the waters around Long Island, but they also assumed the Americans would never attempt such a desperate gamble. Sometimes the most impossible plan was the only one that could succeed. He looked up at Colonel Glover, whose maritime experience might prove invaluable in the hours ahead. "Colonel, how well do your men know these waters?" As the rain continued to fall across Brooklyn Heights, General Washington made one of the most crucial decisions of his military career. By 3 o'clock in the morning of August 29th, 1776, he had committed to an evacuation so audacious that it bordered on the impossible. The entire Continental Army would attempt to cross the East River under cover of darkness, right under the noses of the British fleet. The plan required perfect coordination, absolute silence, and more than a little luck. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment would provide the boats and the maritime expertise needed for the crossing. These Massachusetts fishermen knew how to handle small craft in rough waters, and their knowledge of tides and currents could mean the difference between salvation and disaster. Washington summoned his most trusted officers to outline the operation. The evacuation would proceed in phases, with the wounded and supplies going first, followed by the main body of troops, and finally the rear guard. Every movement had to be coordinated to avoid detection by British patrols or the warships anchored. Nearby, a single musket shot, a shouted order, or the splash of an oar could alert the enemy and doom the entire enterprise. The general's orders were clear, but seemingly impossible to execute. 9,000 men, along with their equipment, artillery, and horses, had to be moved across nearly a mile of open water without being detected. The boats available were a motley collection of fishing vessels, ferries, and small craft commandeered from around New York Harbor. Many were barely seaworthy, and none were designed for military transport under combat conditions. Colonel Glover set about organizing the naval aspects of the retreat with the efficiency of a man who had spent his life at sea. His Marblehead mariners took charge of the boats, while other regiments were assigned specific embarkation points along the Brooklyn shore. The tide would be favorable for only a few hours, and missing that window could trap the entire army until the next night if they survived that long. As preparations began, Washington faced another challenge: maintaining the appearance of normal military activity while secretly preparing for evacuation. Campfires had to be kept burning, sentries had to remain at their posts, and the daily routines of camp life had to continue as if nothing had changed. Any deviation from normal patterns might alert British observers that something was amiss. The general moved through the American lines personally, speaking with company commanders and ensuring that orders were understood and followed. The men were told only what they needed to know for their specific roles, and even senior officers were kept in the dark about the full scope of the operation. Until the last possible moment, secrecy was absolute. A single deserter or captured soldier could reveal the plan to the British. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the already dangerous operation. The rain that had been falling steadily began to intensify. reducing visibility, but also making the river crossing more treacherous. Small boats would be difficult to control in choppy waters, and the risk of capsizing increased with every gust of wind. Yet the same weather that made the crossing more dangerous also provided additional cover from British observation. By midnight, the first boats were ready to depart. Colonel Glover himself took command of the lead vessel, guiding the initial group of wounded soldiers across the dark waters toward Manhattan. The oars were muffled with cloth to reduce noise, and strict orders prohibited any talking above a whisper. The fate of the American Revolution might well depend on how quietly a few hundred fishermen from Massachusetts could row their boats across New York Harbor. As the first boats disappeared into the darkness, Washington remained on the Brooklyn shore, knowing that he would be among the last to leave. A commander's duty was to ensure his men reached safety before considering his own escape. The evacuation proceeded with agonizing slowness. Through the early morning hours of August 29th, each boatload represented both progress toward safety and an increasing risk of discovery. Colonel Glover's mariners worked with quiet efficiency, their experience showing as they navigated the treacherous currents of the East River while maintaining the absolute silence that the operation demanded. General Washington moved constantly along the Brooklyn waterfront, coordinating the movement of troops and supplies while keeping a watchful eye on British positions. The enemy remained ominously quiet in their lines, but whether this indicated confidence in their trap or preparation for a dawn assault remained unclear. Every passing hour brought the Americans closer to safety, but also closer to daylight, an inevitable discovery. The boats available for the crossing were barely adequate for the task at hand. Fishing sloops, ferries, and even small rowboats had been pressed into service, creating a flotilla that would have been comical under any other circumstances. The largest vessels could carry perhaps 60 men, while the smallest managed only 8 or 10 soldiers at a time. At this rate, completing the evacuation before dawn seemed impossible, as if responding to Washington's prayers. Nature itself seemed to conspire in favor of the Americans. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a thick fog began to roll in from the harbor, providing additional cover for the crossing boats. The mist grew so dense that vessels only yards apart became invisible to each other, forcing the mariners to navigate by sound and instinct alone. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, serving as an artillery officer, supervised the movement of the Army's precious cannons. These guns represented a significant portion of the Continental Army's firepower, and losing them would be almost as devastating as losing the men. The artillery pieces had to be manhandled down to the water's edge, loaded onto barges, and secured for the crossing, all while maintaining complete silence. The fog that had seemed like divine intervention soon created new problems. Boats began to lose their way in the murk, and several vessels nearly collided as confused helmsmen struggled to find the Manhattan landing points. Colonel Glover dispatched his most experienced sailors to serve as guides, positioning them at key points to direct the evacuation fleet safely across the treacherous waters. Dr. David Ramsay's historical account of the Revolution, published in 1789, describes this night as one of providential deliverance for the American cause. The combination of weather conditions, British inaction, and exceptional seamanship by the Marblehead Regiment created an opportunity that might never come again. Washington understood that failure here would likely end the war before it had truly begun. By 4 o'clock in the morning, roughly half the army had been successfully evacuated to Manhattan. The pace had improved as the mariners became more familiar with the crossing routes and landing procedures, but time was running short. Dawn was only hours away, and British patrols would soon be moving. The most dangerous phase of the operation was yet to come, evacuating the rear guard while maintaining defensive positions. General Washington faced an agonizing decision about priorities. Artillery and supplies were valuable, but men were irreplaceable. Horses could be left behind, but trained officers and experienced soldiers were the foundation upon which any future army would be built. Every choice carried consequences that could affect the outcome of the war. As the sky began to show the first hints of gray in the east, Washington realized that not everyone would make it across before daylight. The rear guard would have to hold their positions until the last possible moment, buying time for the final boats to escape. These men would face the greatest danger, but without their sacrifice, the entire operation could still fail. The general began making his final preparations for the most perilous hours of the retreat. Dawn approached Brooklyn Heights with the inexorable certainty of fate itself. General Washington stood at the water's edge, watching the last boats of his army disappear into the fog-shrouded East River. Behind him, a skeleton force of picked men maintained the illusion of a full military presence, keeping campfires burning and sentries at their posts while the bulk of the Continental Army slipped away into the Manhattan darkness. The deception had worked far longer than anyone had dared hope. British patrols remained in their positions, apparently convinced that the Americans were still trapped and waiting for the inevitable final assault. But with each passing minute, the risk of discovery increased exponentially. A single British scout venturing too close to the American lines would reveal the truth. Most of Washington's army was gone. Colonel Edward Haynes' Pennsylvania riflemen formed the backbone of the rear guard, their long rifles providing the accuracy needed to discourage British reconnaissance. These frontiersmen understood the deadly game they were playing, maintaining just enough activity to convince distant observers that foe regiments still occupied the Brooklyn fortifications. Every movement had to be calculated, every sound considered, for its effect on enemy perceptions. The fog that had provided such crucial cover throughout the night began to thin as the sun climbed higher. What had been a blessing now threatened to become a curse, as British observers would soon be able to see across the water to Manhattan. If enemy warships spotted the evacuation boats, their cannons could devastate the helpless vessels loaded with retreating soldiers. Washington faced his most difficult moment as commander when he realized that not all of his men would escape. Several hundred soldiers remained on Brooklyn Heights, including some of his most reliable officers and veteran troops. These men had volunteered to stay behind, knowing that they might be sacrificing their lives to save their comrades. Their courage in the face of almost certain capture or death represented the finest qualities of the Continental Army. The general's decision to remain with the rear guard until the very end exemplified the leadership that would define his entire military career. Unlike many officers of his era, Washington understood that asking men to face danger meant sharing that danger himself. His tall figure moving among the remaining troops provided inspiration and reassurance that their commander would not abandon them to fate. As 7 o'clock approached, the last of the evacuation boats prepared to depart. These final vessels were overcrowded and riding dangerously low in the water, but they represented the difference between salvation and disaster for hundreds of Continental soldiers. Colonel Glover personally commanded the final ferry, his weathered hands steady on the tiller despite the enormous pressure of the moment. The British fleet remained anchored in the harbor, their crews apparently unaware that the largest military evacuation in American history was taking place almost under their guns. The HMS Asia and HMS Phoenix maintained their patrols, but the fog and early morning light created conditions that favored the escaping Americans. What should have been an impossible feat of military logistics was succeeding through a combination of skill, courage, and extraordinary luck. Washington finally stepped into the last boat as British trumpets began to sound in the distance. Whether these signals indicated the beginning of the expected assault or simply routine morning activities remained unclear, but there was no time to find out. The rear guard had done its job, maintaining the deception long enough for the evacuation to succeed. As the final boat pushed off from the Brooklyn shore, Washington looked back at the fortifications his army had built and defended. They were leaving behind artillery, supplies, and equipment that could not be replaced. But they were taking with them something far more valuable, the core of an army that could continue the fight for independence. The success of the Long Island evacuation would prove to be one of the turning points of the American Revolution. The last boat pushed away from the Brooklyn shore just as the morning light began to penetrate the fog that had sheltered the American evacuation throughout the night. General Washington sat in the stern, his eyes fixed on the British positions that were slowly becoming visible through the lifting mist. In a matter of minutes, enemy observers would discover that the Continental Army had vanished like morning dew, leaving behind only empty fortifications and cold campfires. Colonel John Glover guided their overloaded vessel through the tricky currents of the East River with the skill of a man who had spent his entire life at sea. The boat rode dangerously low in the water, packed with the last of Washington's rear guard and whatever equipment they could salvage. Every wave that lapped over the gunwales reminded the passengers how precarious their situation remained, even with Brooklyn Heights fading behind them. The fog that had provided such crucial concealment was rapidly dissipating as the sun climbed higher. Manhattan's shoreline became visible across the water, tantalizingly close yet still perilously distant. British warships lay at anchor between the escaping Americans and safety, their crews beginning to stir with the dawn watch. The HMS Phoenix was particularly well positioned to intercept any vessels attempting to cross the river, her 36 guns capable of devastating any target within range. As their boat approached the halfway point of the crossing, Washington could see other vessels from the evacuation fleet scattered across the water like leaves on a pond. Some had already reached the Manhattan shore and were unloading their human cargo, while others struggled against the current and the growing daylight. The success of the operation depended not just on his boat reaching safety, but on every single vessel completing the crossing before the British realized what had happened. The sound of drums echoing across the water from Brooklyn Heights sent a chill through every man in the boat. British forces were beginning their morning routines, and it would only be moments before they discovered the abandoned American positions. When that happened, the enemy fleet would spring into action, hunting down any boats still on the water with ruthless efficiency. Colonel Glover's mariners rowed with steady, powerful strokes, their experience showing in every coordinated movement. These men had pulled nets through stormy seas off the Grand Banks and knew how to work together when lives depended on their skill. The rhythm of their oars cutting through the dark water provided a counterpoint to the growing tension as the race against discovery entered its final phase. Washington used these precious minutes to consider the strategic implications of their escape. The loss of Long Island was undeniably a defeat, but the preservation of the Continental Army was a victory of far greater importance. These 9,000 men represented the core of American resistance, and without them, the cause of independence would have died on the shores of Brooklyn Heights. The British had won a battle, but they had failed to win the war. The Manhattan shoreline loomed larger with each passing minute, but so did the danger of detection. British sentries on the warships were beginning to move about their duties, and sharp eyes might spot the evacuation boats even through the remaining patches of fog. The next few minutes would determine whether Washington's desperate gamble would succeed, or whether the Continental Army would be destroyed piecemeal on the waters of New York Harbor. As they approached the Manhattan landing point, Washington could see American soldiers already forming up on the shore, preparing defensive positions in case British forces attempted a pursuit. The sight of these men, safely evacuated from what had seemed like certain destruction, filled the general with a profound sense of relief. The impossible had been accomplished through the courage of ordinary soldiers and the skill of Massachusetts fishermen who had never imagined their maritime experience would help save a revolution. The boat's keel scraped against the Manhattan shore just as shouts erupted from the British lines across the water. The boats hull ground against the Manhattan shore with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. In the early morning stillness, General Washington stepped quickly onto the rocky beach, his boots splashing in the shallow water as Colonel Glover's mariners secured their vessel. Behind them, across the East River, the first British trumpets were sounding the alarm as enemy forces discovered the abandoned American fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. Washington turned to survey his army, scattered along the Manhattan waterfront in various states of exhaustion and relief. 9,000 men had been successfully evacuated from what should have been certain destruction, but they were no longer the confident force that had first faced the British on Long Island. Their uniforms were torn and muddy, their equipment was scattered or lost, and their morale had been shattered by the devastating defeat they had suffered. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the water as British gunners began targeting the few American boats still making the crossing. The HMS Phoenix had finally realized what was happening and was attempting to intercept the stragglers, but the fog and the courage of the Marblehead mariners allowed most of the remaining vessels to reach safety. The evacuation that military experts would later call impossible had been completed with the loss of fewer than a dozen men. Colonel Alexander Hamilton approached Washington with a preliminary count of men and equipment. The numbers told the story of both disaster and salvation. Nearly 1,500 casualties from the Battle of Long Island, but 9,000 soldiers preserved to fight another day. Most importantly, the core of experienced officers and veteran troops had been saved, providing the foundation for rebuilding the Continental Army into an effective fighting force. As the morning sun burned away the last of the fog, the full scope of the British victory on Long Island became apparent. General Howe's forces controlled Brooklyn Heights and could see clearly across to Manhattan, where the American army was regrouping. British naval superiority meant that New York itself was now untenable, and Washington would soon face another difficult decision about when and where to make his next stand. But the successful evacuation had accomplished something far more important than merely preserving soldiers and equipment. Washington had demonstrated that the Continental Army could survive even devastating defeats, that American forces could outmaneuver and outwit their professional European opponents, and that the cause of independence would not die with a single battle. The retreat from Long Island became a template for the strategic withdrawals that would characterize Washington's approach throughout the war. The general gathered his senior officers for an immediate council of war, knowing that the British would not allow them time to recover from their ordeal. Manhattan was now exposed to attack from multiple directions, and holding the city would be impossible with the forces available. The painful lesson of Long Island was that the Continental Army could not match British professionals in conventional battles, but they could survive to fight on more favorable terms. Over the following months and years, Washington would refine the strategy that began with the evacuation from Brooklyn Heights. The Continental Army would avoid major battles when possible, strike at isolated British units when opportunities arose, and always preserve the core of trained soldiers that represented America's hope for independence. The flexibility and mobility that saved 9,000 men on August 29, 1776 would eventually wear down British resolve and win American freedom. Colonel Glover's Marblehead Regiment had played the crucial role in this transformation, their maritime skills providing the means for what many would call the most important retreat in American military history. These Massachusetts fishermen had helped save not just an army, but a revolution itself. Their boats and their courage had purchased time for the Continental Army to learn, adapt, and ultimately prevail. As Washington looked back across the East River toward Brooklyn Heights, now bristling with British flags and enemy soldiers, he understood that the war had truly begun. The retreat was over, but the real fight for American independence was just beginning. The lessons learned in those dark hours of evacuation would guide him through the trials ahead. From the crossing of the Delaware to the final victory at Yorktown, the impossible escape from Long Island had given birth to a new kind of warfare and a new nation.